These are just photographs from some of the drills. So this is one of the hazmats. Our hazmat is actually a structure that's in our garage that's near our hospital, or our ED entrance, and so we drill in there. The first time we did that, it was on a July day. We used our new hazmat equipment, and it was great. They were all excited about getting it all set up and using it for the first time because we hadn't really done this. So it's July, but in Cleveland, it's usually pretty hot in July. It's usually like in the 80s. Well, this was a July day. It was 70 degrees outside. It was going to be the high temperature that day. It was cloudy, and they discovered that the hot water didn't work really well. So you've never seen kids run through a hazmat so fast. They all were in bathing suits and had to take showers, and they were all coming out and they were blue. But that was, we never would have known that if we hadn't actually done the drill with the hazmat and kids, because you have to have it at least at 98 degrees, if not a little bit warmer, because they get cold so fast, and it was really interesting. They're like, they're not taking a shower long enough, they're not deconning. I'm like, well, they're cold, so this is, thank goodness it was just a drill and not a real situation. But it allowed us to think about our hazmat in a garage in the middle of winter if we had to use it. What are we going to do? So we looked at the heaters a little bit more effectively. We looked at how we warm our water and things like that. So it was actually really helpful. This is another incident from Aaron Gardner, who's a critical care physician in Idaho Falls, and this was actually at Cincinnati Children's. So this was a mass casualty incident that was done on a regional basis, and he tells a funny story. So the Cincinnati Children's sees about 100,000 visits per year. And they knew this drill was happening, and they got the notification, and they were expecting patients to come in, live patients, and so on and so forth. So instead, they had an ambulance drive up to their bay and dropped off 20 mannequins that were all blown up, and they just threw them in the ED. So they were like, this isn't nearly the same kind of thing of expecting real children. And so things that we learned. So as I mentioned, you need to identify an observer with each of the pediatric patients in our hospital. So we usually use nursing students and paramedic students. They're really excited to participate in these kinds of drills. Sometimes medical students will do this. We're on an academic campus in an urban area, so this makes it easier to find these kinds of individuals. So the other thing is incorporating children as young as you can go. Some people only drill down to the age of 8, and they'll say, well, you need to act like a 2-year-old. Well, an 8-year-old might be able to do that, but if you can really get a family unit in there and do it with a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, you'll end up with a really different kind of scenario about how they act, how does that water act, how does actually getting them through a hazmat actually work. And then we actually drill with our adult colleagues now. So we were the first, pediatric hospital was actually the first hospital on our campus to actually do drills with live patients. And my EMA guys, when I said, well, why aren't we doing real patients, looked at me and said, well, we just don't do that. And I'm like, well, why not? And I didn't take no for an answer, and so we were able to drill with live patients before the adult colleagues were. But then putting the adult colleagues in makes it much more realistic, because you're gonna we're a campus that gets both pediatric and adult patients, and so we have to be able to do that. And we've incorporated OB patients in too, because that's something that would obviously happen. So we obviously discovered that you need to notify the entire hospital that you're drilling. So we usually send out we have a pretty significant disaster onboarding process that is part of for all our new employees that come in, including residents, because we're an academic medical center. And so this is, you have to educate them on what disaster stuff they need to know about, but we also send out communication about the drill within about a week before it happens and then the day before it happens. We have ongoing hazmat recruitment and education, because people fall off the hazmat team pretty easily. We drill every area in the hospital. We've actually created we have a worksheet that we use that goes with each patient. So not only do they have a patient scenario on them, but there's actually a worksheet that is actually recorded by the observer. They check off times, they check off all sorts of things on that, and it actually collects supply chain information too. So especially in a mass casualty incident, you want to know, how many bandage packets did they need, how many IVs, how much IV fluid, because it really helps you understand what the supply chain might need to look like. We created a buddy system for especially specific areas like the emergency department. And then communication is always really important. I think communication is always the thing that people always notice in a disaster as a problem. And we end up, through our drills, we discovered that our radios don't work in certain parts. of the hospital. So, you've got somebody walking down the hall with a patient, they're communicating where they're going to go, but they can't do it. So what we've done now is we actually, once a month, we do radio drills, where we actually just do a drill to make sure, and we do it on different shifts so that everybody gets practice with using the radios that we use. And so we actually do that once a month to make sure, you do the disaster call on the radio. And then every quarter, we actually stay on the radio for communication for 3 hours. So it'll be at like a certain time on the shift. So all reports for all patient reports get called to the floor through the radio. Everything goes through the radio channels so that we actually know how to use it so that every staff member gets a chance to practice using the radios. Education to your trainees. Medical trainees, medical students are very eager. They want to do a lot of stuff. So do nursing students, paramedics. And so what we do is we actually try and educate them on what their roles can actually be, and we make sure that they're working with licensed providers, either physicians or nurses and things like that, because they can extend that person, but you've got to be careful what roles you actually use them in. And then especially communication at all hours is really important. As they noticed in Boston, when they had the Boston Marathon, you just really have to be able to find those extra bodies to bring in. And so understanding what your communication tree looks like is really important. So this is another thing to think about. When you're doing hazmat and you have like infants and you're gonna actually wash an infant through a hazmat shower, they're bad enough when they're in a tub and you're a parent trying to just take care of an infant, let alone put them in a basket or how you're going to do that. So think about how that looks. And if you've ever tried to talk to a child through a PAPR, it doesn't work so well. Your garbled sounds, you're kind of scary looking. So think about how those things look, and think about, and if you've ever, when you do these hazmat drills, watching kids get undressed, plus there's a group of kids, they have a lot of fun doing this. So it changes the whole character of it. It changes the time that you would estimate that this is all going to happen. So the other thing that becomes important is reunification drills. So Sarita Chung has actually done a lot of work in this area, and reunification drills are really important. So, looking at, sort of creating, either putting in an unidentified child or something like that into your regular drill can be really helpful. Those of us that are at pediatric hospitals, we routinely get like 2-year-olds that are found missing on the streets, brought in by police all the time, and so it's, a kid that can't tell me their name other than it, and what's your mom's name? It's mommy. So these are important things to think about, is how do you register those kids? How are you going to track them? What you're going to do? What's your reunification process look like? Because in our state, that child, just because they're missing, doesn't mean that they're under the custody of DCFS, which is our family services. So that's not always the right answer to call them. And law enforcement, especially in a disaster, is not going to have the wherewithal to actually help figure out the tracking of all those missing kids. So it's important to sort of start to think about how you're going to do that registration system. And I think Boston had some really interesting ideas because families were looking for their loved ones at all these various hospitals and either walking or calling to find them. And messaging to community and families about how you're going to do this reunification process is going to be really important. And then really reviewing your plans for unaccompanied minors. So in reunification, it's really important to have secure areas for children. So, and it's important to have a family reception area, and it's important to have a separate reunification area for the children and families to meet up. And for the unaccompanied minors, they actually have to be in a separate area even from the other children, because it's pretty upsetting for a child to keep seeing somebody going out and getting reunified, and they kind of figure it out. It doesn't take long. And knowing that kids aren't with their guardians, we've already talked about that. Younger kids, they'll all call their mommy or their daddy, and that'll be their name. They won't be able to tell you much more than that. So, and kids are really vulnerable in disaster situations to being exploited. So this is, Ohio is almost one of the #1 sex trafficking places in the country, which I'm not proud of, but it's something to think about, is that, in disasters, kids are really vulnerable to being exploited, and that's just a scary thing to sort of think about. So this was this NICU virtual exercise was a drill that we did for the entire state of Ohio. We did it on a virtual platform. We had SimCell and Columbus that acted as virtual partners for fire, EMS, EMA, American Academy of Pediatrics, Ohio Department of Health were there. It was a severe weather event in central Ohio. 3 NICUs in the local Columbus area were the evacuating facilities. We had 27 surge facilities that were statewide. And we had 3 functional modules that went over this whole thing. So we had a patient assessment model, a placement module, and a transport model. So in the patient assessment, we actually have a statewide database called SurgeNet, which actually does our bed capacity on a daily basis, and every hospital uses it. And in that one, we actually have number of NICU beds, type of NICU beds, we have pediatric beds, pediatric ICU beds, and then we have all the adult beds. And so some of our NICUs actually are based at OB hospitals or adult hospitals, so we knew about them and so on. So everybody used their actual census on that day, and then they had to go through and they had to do, the evacuating hospitals had to do an assessment of all the patients and fill out a transport form. But we actually had the surge facilities do that, so we got more information on the form that we had created. And then the next module was a placement module where they actually, evacuating hospitals had to call and see where they were going to place patients. And so what they did is they kept a pretty good track record over time about where they were going to, who they called and how long it took to give report on these patients to figure out where they were going to go. And of course, these were all sort of timed modules, so it was kind of artificial, so not every patient got placed and so on. And then transport, how are they going to get there, And we quickly found out that in the state of Ohio, we were going to run out of assets really fast. It wasn't going to take long. And what they did is the evacuating hospitals actually timed how long it would take. How long is it going to take to get that helicopter from there to our hospital, back again? Then you have to think about cleaning it and getting staff and so on and so forth. It was a great exercise. And we quickly drilled to failure, which is what you usually want to do. So major strength was we had real-time feedback on our acuity tools. Most of the facilities were able to do their patient census and tracking and able to get key points of communication out about to the families. So these were the key after-action items that we had. So most of the hospitals could use our state-wide bed tracking system as well as our patient tracking system, which we have, which gets entered in when we have a large drill. But we need to create better awareness for our NICU staff. The acuity tool we used in real time gave us a lot of feedback, and it's being kind of at the point where I've sent it out to other institutions to actually start using this as part of their disaster stuff. Transportation resources, there's a lot of, isolates don't fit in normal ambulances all the time. They have to be specially equipped. So it's something to think about. There are some special transport isolates that you can get. There are special ways you can make accommodations, but you quickly run out. And then actually our hospitals across the state want more pediatric exercises on a virtual platform. And the CDC and the AP have actually done some nice work with virtual exercises also. And it's a way of getting more exercises into everybody's hands and sort of getting out there and practicing and working out, well, who are my community partners? How am I going to transport those patients? And these are just some resources for you that I've found have been very helpful, but these are available on the internet. And then these are resources for drills that you can use. If you want to just, start pulling these down, it can be very helpful. And then there's actually Sarita Chung and my friend Rachel Charney did this family reunification following disasters. They did a reunification toolkit for hospitals that can actually be very helpful, but it needs to be set up with your community too. In addition, there's a lot of resources for how to keep track of, how to communicate where your patients are at. And so, in conclusion, handling kids with the surge just begins with just thoughtful, intelligent preparation because they're just not adults.